If you can, drop some things on the chat. Okay, I see 18 people. Okay, great. Thanks for joining us. We are excited to have you here. Welcome to our today's webinar. I'm Nenad, and I'll be moderating it today. First thing, to introduce you to all this, as you guys know, this is the very niche topic, and I believe that a lot of you guys will enjoy it. And this is one of the reasons why to be here. The second reason why we are excited to be here is that this webinar is prepared by Martin Jelinek and Roberto Sbrola. And I had the opportunity to work with these guys for a year and a half now, and here is my experience so far. I can say that there is no one who is more capable of explaining complex things in a very simple and interesting way than Martin. And also something that I saw and noticed is that there is no one else who is more organized than Roberto. And please, I haven't met these people.
Wow.
So therefore, I think, when you connect these two dots, that you're in for a treat in this one. And finally, why do we have moderator on this webinar? So our goal is to make these webinars as interactive as possible, which means that we would like to include you in the conversation. These topics can be very broad. It can be very detailed. So please feel free to use the fact that you're live, that you're here with us, to comment, and to post any type of questions that you would like to get answered to. And in the future, we hope that we make this even more interactive, and to invite you to participate with us on some future webinars as well. One more thing to say, that this webinar will be recorded, and because there is a lot of graphs, a lot of calculations, formulas, I think that this will be very useful for you guys. And also, we can start. So I would like to give the word to our two presenters today. I don't want to call them hosts, because they're in the room above me. They're our guys from Map Agents. So guys, please take it away from here, and you can start your presentation.
All right, Nenad. Thank you very much, and hello everybody who turned in, whether you're LTV friends or ROAS friends or enemies, and welcome to our webinar. We have prepared a bit of a presentation for today. I think it's going to last around 50 minutes. We're going to cover quite a lot of ground, and let's just jump right into it. So to introduce the topic a little bit, which Nenad kind of did partially already, what is it that we're going to be covering today? So it's not just going to be about predictions of ad revenue ROAS. It's also going to be about calculating it. So we like to take it kind of from the ground up. Why ad revenue? It's a very, very common way of monetizing things, of monetizing games. We're going to be using the retention times outbound method, and we're going to really try to explain it in quite a comprehensive way today. And why for grandmas? That's got a lot to do with this level of comprehensiveness, and also because it's a data topic. It's November, it's dark. We kind of wanted to lighten things up a little bit. So it's both connected to kind of the level of this webinar, but also with a couple of memes we will see throughout the presentation. And the main goal for this whole thing, is going to be to basically empower you to do the whole LTV/ROAS predictions and calculations at home. So we'd really like to take the concepts from the ground up and try to explain things as we would try to explain that to our grandma to a certain extent. So before we jump into the content, a quick outline of what we're going to be covering today. The webinar will be split into 5 sections, and we're going to cover 3 basic concepts. First, we're going to start with some fundamentals. Everybody probably knows what. I'd like to touch it quickly, elaborate a bit why we want to be looking at the curves versus just data points, and how the whole calculation will look like. For the concepts, the first concept will be about calculating the LTV, right? So just getting the basic curve shape from the retention and ARPDAU data. The second concept will be about predicting unknown retention points. So we will run for an example of, let's say that we've got data for day 120. We don't have any additional data. So how do we even approach predicting retention or LTV data on day 365? So we would like to discuss the approach and limitations and kind of expand on the curve. And the last concept will be retention profiles and how to use them. So basically, it's going to be the usage of the full curve to perform LTV and ROAS predictions. And once we're done with these concepts, once we are going to be armed with all of these, we will go through a very, let's say, practical example of doing the data analysis. So we're going to pull out some real data, show how we would identify and analyze retention profiles, and how would be using all of that for new channel analysis and for cohort analysis. So basically, we should be covering everything from the fundamental, let's say, definition up until the actual practical usage of the retention profiles. So that's basically the content for today. It's, as Nenad mentioned, it's like a multi-layer topic. You can approach it with different layers of expertise. So today, I would kind of like to be upfront with what is it that we're going to be covering, and hopefully it's going to make sense for you, and you will learn a thing or two, or perhaps strengthen the understanding of some concept. So we're the hosts for today. It's me and Roberto, and I will now pass over to Roberto so he can also introduce himself.
Yes, welcome everybody. I'm here today since I kind of, let's say, LTV evangelist. I was recently speaking at Games Camp in Warsaw about this topic. I'm a Grow consultant, and I'm working day to day with a game developer to help them to grow their business. And LTV understanding is absolutely fundamental. And I think that this kind of going through the process of calculating everything can definitely help all the game developer as well all the marketers that are active on these topics. And about myself, as I mentioned, grow marketers. I'm working in marketing pretty much since every time, and I am the grandpa of the company here. And absolutely, I love the topic, and I'm sure that you're gonna enjoy it. And here we have our head of marketing.
Thanks, Roberto. I'm the head of marketing, but today I'm here rather as a data enthusiast, and I worked a lot of years in my own company creating games for Facebook, and then started with games on mobile. And so far, 6 years I've been an app agent, consulting on apps and games, and learning a lot of things. And one of the things we will cover today. So, Roberto, do you want to say a few things about App Agent also?
Yes, absolutely. We are helping game developers, apps to grow and scale their game or apps, and we're helping them from the launch until the scaling phase. And we are working as well on creative production because it's so critical to have good results and bring positive ROAS nowadays. And absolutely, we're happy to help, and I hope that you will enjoy the content today in this webinar.
All right, thank you for a great introduction. And with that, I believe we can jump right into the content.
Absolutely.
So first of all, a bit of a warm-up and terminology as the first section of our content. So what is ROAS? And I guess everybody here should know that it's return on ad spend, to kind of build things from the ground up. I would like to talk a bit about a super trivial example. In case we had a premium app, basically something that you buy for a certain price and then you never ever pay again, the ROAS will be calculated by the purchase price. It's like a one-time fee, right? So it's one number. And we divide it by the CPA, so the cost per acquisition. And the beauty of this is you don't really have to predict anything, right? Because these things usually happen on day zero. So you kind of have a perfect understanding of your cohorts. But kind of sadly for us marketers, that's not really how that works in the real life. And prevalent monetization models are different, right?
Unfortunately not.
So usually now it's in-app purchases, it's ad monetization, it's subscription or different combinations of these. But what they've got in common is that the LTV in these cases basically gets accumulated over a long period of time. So in this case, we can't really look at that as one number. We really have to look at it as a living organism that keeps changing throughout the cohorts or the user's life cycle. So in case of the ROAS, and now we're already getting a bit closer to what we're going to be actually predicting, The CPI is a static thing. We get it on day 0, but for the LTV, we will only recoup that. We will only understand that throughout some time. So if you're going to be predicting something, right, like we're going to be, of course, predicting the LTV part. And one of the reasons why the points, just like a snapshots, let's say ROAS on day 60 or LTV on day 60, does not really work that well, is because there is this kind of an evolution and the numbers can be very misleading. And as Roberto mentioned, we really want the LTV to look like a curve, something like you see here, where you don't only have the 1-day snapshot, but we understand how it evolves over time, and we can compare it with the CPI. And well, the grandma says that she's not persuaded yet.
Yeah.
So let's see about the LTV curves on an example. So this is a simple example. Let's say we've got 3 games and we measure LTV on day 30. So you see that there's different values, right? And let's say there's no other data available. So which ones of these would you actually think can perform the best? Where would you invest your money? And Roberto, I know you want to speak, but
Yeah,
I think you're too good for that.
Okay,
Maybe we should have Nenad speak and tell us what he thinks.
You're asking me which one I should pick?
Yes.
Maybe to ask audience for help, but I guess number 1 with $1 is the best, but it seems like a trick question. So, tell me, please.
So I think we can have Roberto speak a bit about that.
Yeah, one of the common mistakes that we see in many small or even medium developers that are coming and they actually have this mindset to consider the LTV with the number, but actually you only get the grasp of only what is behind and the potential that you can, the usage, all the potential usage that you can leverage when you start to add the time. So it really depends on how the LTV evolves and how LTV evolves after 30 days. So, okay, at 30 days at the moment, we have a number, but how this is going to look like in the future. And that's something really relevant that you really have to understand, because if you have more capacity on LTV, you actually can use it to fight against the cost that you are having on the user acquisition, and then find a better profitability. So maybe we can try to uncover now what's the best solution.
Yep, let's uncover that. By the way, Simar, you're kind of right. Partially, of course, it depends on the CPI. But truth be told, a lot of that and a lot of the decision making should be based on the LTV curves. So in the example 1, there was $1 LTV on day 30. But theoretically, the curve, you don't really know what happens beyond day 30. So it's quite unlikely it would be flat, but it can be flat. On the other side, for the example 2, we had the lowest day 30 accumulated LTV. But here we see that the retention profile or the LTV profile is actually quite favorable. So there's not a lot of churn, and it's clear that this curve will continue to be bringing money over a long period of time. And example 3, it would be probably quite somewhere in between. So what we're kind of trying to show, in case you only have a number on day 30, let's say, it doesn't really tell you much about what's going to happen after that. And only once you understand the shape of the curve and how long would the monetization take, you can make pretty good conclusions about, for example, how much are you willing to invest, right? Because it's really dependent on the recoup time, and as Simar mentioned,
there are so many,
the CPI.
The curve itself tells so many things, and the information that you can get from the shape itself can be brought on financial level, on game design. For example, why a curve start to flat after 30 days. So there are so many questions that some answer that you can get from the shape that you can take it back on your pipeline, take it back on user acquisition, take it back on financial decisions. So it's really important to understand and to actually visualize the curve.
Agree. And I believe that Grandma here actually agrees with you.
I hope so.
And the question now is, in case we really are sure that we want to have the LTV curve as a visualization, right? So how do we get it? How do we visualize it? How do we calculate it? So that brings us to the concept number 1, and that's creating LTV curves. So in this case, what we're going to be using, and that's mostly because we're talking about ad-monetized games and apps, we're going to be using the retention times ARPDAU calculation. And you've probably heard about it many times. It's quite a common knowledge nowadays, but I don't know a lot of people that can kind of explain how that is actually done in the real life case. So let's talk about that. To get the LTV, we need two ingredients, and it's going to be retention, and we will transform the retention into some metric that we call lifetime days or average active days. And we're going to need ARPDAU as average revenue per daily active user. Once we combine it, we're going to get the LTV. And in terms of the fundamental logic behind the calculation, you can probably imagine that if I launch the ad for the first time or for the second time, I'm actually active. I play the game, then I consume a certain number of ads. So the number of ads will generate some sense of revenue. And in case I understand this ARPDAU, and then just multiply it by the number of days that I expect to be active throughout some period of time, I'm going to understand the LTV. So that's the fundamental logic. And let's now take a bit closer look about how this is actually calculated. And let's do it on an actual example, right? So as you see, I've got two charts here, and I'm gonna be using them to observe the behavior, or let's say how the behavior translates into metrics of a new cohort. So this is day 0, right? On day 0, there's always 100% retention because basically everybody who launched the app is active. And if we look at the cumulative chart of the lifetime days, well, users were active on average for 1 day because everybody was active on that day. So what happens if we move to day 1? We see the retention dropping to 60% now, but for the lifetime days, because it's a cumulative metric, now the average moves up by the 60% number. So now it moves from 1 to 1.6. If we move to day number 2, the same thing happens. So basically 40% of people come back. So in that case, 40% or 0.4 lifetime days are being added to our cumulative chart. And that's basically how we continue doing it forever, or for whatever long period we want to calculate this for. So in this case, we end with 7 days. And after 7 days, we understand that cumulatively, on average, we can expect each new user to be active at least 3 days, something a bit more than that. So now, if we go back to the calculation, well, now we got the first LTV ingredient. That's the retention here represented by the active days. And for the ARPDAU, this is something that in this case, we're just taking from a report, but of course it can be broken down in different ways. And if we multiply the retention times ARPDAU, in this case, if we multiply this 313 by 0.25, we would get the retention data point for day 7.
Yeah, just to give more information about ARPDAU, of course, normally we take this directly from the mobile measurement partner, and it's something that we can calculate as well based on the retention, the revenue fraction, the daily active user. And it's something that you can expand, so you can understand what is behind, what is the trigger, what is element to improve ARPDAU. So it's a part of the equation that can be expanded, but in this case, we are going to try to make it simple and to just have it, the number in terms of how much revenue we generate per daily active user.
All right, thanks Roberto for the additional color. And now let's kind of move towards the end of the calculation, right? So as we mentioned, once we've got the cumulative curve of the lifetime days and we've got the ARPDAU, we basically just multiply each of these data points to get the LTV cumulative curve. So we'd be at somewhere $0.8 on day 7. So that's amazing. We got a beginning of a retention curve, right? And if we go back to our, let's say, framework of calculations on what we actually predict, we now understand that we're not predicting CPI, that's a given, so it's going to be the LTV. And what we're going to be predicting is not the ARPDAU, because we mentioned it's an average that we're going to be using. So what really the whole thing comes down to is calculating retention and predicting retention.
Yeah, if you go back 1 moment, I really would like to point out, so definitely you have to check if your game you're monetizing with ads, you have a relatively stable ARPDAU. That's kind of assumption to do this kind of prediction. Normally you have seasonality, of course, but in general, there should be, of course, you try maybe to improve it. Of course, you should do with monetization. But in this case, we cannot take it like as a variable that is not changed, actually. It's a fixed value.
Thanks, Roberto. And absolutely true. And ARPDAU can be fluctuating based on a number of different things, right? But that's usually out of your control and it's hard to expect. Like, for example, you can expect that the CPMs will be higher throughout the Christmas time, or you can try to get some seasonality to kind of predict how it's going to evolve. But it's usually connected to macro events and competition and things like that. So we usually take some kind of an average because just it's impossible to really predict. So moving on, this was the first concept, or a part of the first concept about calculating the LTV, and we did 7 days. But now what happens beyond the 7 days? And you already saw that if we want to calculate the cumulative number of active days, we need the data points for each and every day. And it's not really what a lot of the tools give us. So quite frequently we'll be faced with having 0, 1, 7, 30, 90 days. So it's really kind of snapshots from the curve. And we have to find a way to turn these snapshots into basically 1 point for every single day. This is how it would look on a chart, right? So it's not a curve, it's kind of just a set of data points. So how do we do it? We're just gonna show you very quickly and very easily how we're doing it. We interpolate that in a linear fashion. There's multiple ways to do it. There's different fittings on the curve, but this linear interpolation looked like the best way. Or you can just use option 1, which is to use one of the tables that we will provide after the webinar, kind of for free use, where you just input the retention points for certain days, and it's just going to calculate everything for you. So, but yes, of course, we're here to kind of show how it's being done and not just share some tables. So let's do a bit of a demonstration. If you are going to be interpolating these points, we're always interpolating between 2 data points. So let's kind of now zoom into this rectangle to have a better view of what happens in between day 1 and day 7. So what we see here is that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 days in between. So there's going to be 6 steps. And throughout these 6 days or 6 steps, we actually have to be losing 22% of our retention value. So in this case, we just divide that. We divide the 22 by 6, and we get an average, let's say, decrease of the retention metric per step, per day. And just like that, we got all the numbers that we need. And if you imagine this thing just being somewhere in a table, you can already calculate the active days from these data points. And just another super quick example, if we just want to continue with the next segment, in this case, we'd be taking day 7 and day 30. And once again, 26 divide 26 minus 16, it's 10%. That's being 10 percentage points. That's kind of being decreased over the course of, in this case, I believe it's 23 days. So it's 0.4 something percent per day. So once again, you put that into a table, and there you go. You've got a data point for each of the days. And you can do it for the other segments. So if we zoom out, you can basically just by having these couple of numbers that you can read from a report, you can interpolate them. And just like this, you can have them for basically the first 120 days. So that's what we've got now. We basically got ourselves a good approximation of the first 120 days of retention. And if we wanted to, we can just take the retention and use the same method that we did before. So just turn the retention into the number of active days, like a cumulative metric, then multiplied it by ARPDAU, we get the LTV. And then if we like divided that by the CPI, we would get the ROAS. So we kind of are focusing on the retention here, but this is how it translates back at the top to the actual calculation. Other recommendation, of course, once you kind of understand, if you want to understand how the interpolation is being done, would rather be really just use the tool, because we already did the heavy lifting, and this was just to show the method.
Yeah, in general, it's really to show that with Excel, it's you can do actually pretty much everything. And as a starting point, it's absolutely super using this like in day to day.
Yep. I agree. And by the way, what we're showing here is like we purposefully try to show things without complicated formulas or without any advanced data work behind it, because the idea was to make things hopefully approachable. So now you got the 120 days, and we basically calculated our retention and theoretically also the LTV on these 120 days. But what if we go beyond 120 days? What if we want to, for example, predict what happens with the retention metric on day 360? So how would we even approach it, right? Let's say we don't really have any historical data whatsoever. So our grandma here wants to call Daisy that she knows these things, but we probably won't need Daisy and her cards and her crystal balls. We're probably just gonna need our brains and minds. So this is what probably you would hear people talking about and doing, right? You've got some data points and you kind of fit them on a mathematically defined curve. So it can be logarithmic, it can be exponential. It's very neat, it's very nice, but it just gives you some mathematical representation that can be, but doesn't really have to be true. So it's an interesting thing to look at, but I would not really kind of sacrifice or bet my life on something like that. And what I believe is a better option is to check multiple scenarios that can happen with, let's say, the 120 days that we have already. And let's take a look at them now. So scenario one, right? You see that here we're ending on day 120. And in this case, the retention will just be stable. We won't really get any follow. So it's very favorable. I don't believe it can realistically happen for games, but that's one scenario, right? So we can take that as like the best possible option. In some cases, even like the curve can be smiling, but I've never seen that for games. Scenario two, that would be probably the worst case scenario, that basically we're still losing the same number of users in absolute terms on each and every single day. So this is how we'd go about it. And in this case, we're just losing a certain percentage of these users. And the idea is not to be overly precise with this, just to kind of model the best worst case scenarios and see what it actually gives us in terms of the LTV. So now we've got just the retention numbers, right? But what does it mean? How much money are we actually making in these cases? So I prepared this curve that really shows you what can be happening from this day 120 onwards. So in this scenario one, where we can consider there's going to be absolutely no churn, we would have roughly $8.5. And in the worst case scenario, it would be $5. Of course, it's with the given ARPDAU. And
well, the $8.6 looks good to me. I think I would go for that if I could.
That's true, man. That's true, man. I think a lot of people would. But what we're trying to demonstrate here is, you've got quite some uncertainty, but at the same time, you kind of decrease the uncertainty, because before you had no idea what can you expect, and now you kind of understand what does it actually mean in terms of the monetary value of the LTV. But the range is quite huge, right? It's like from 5 to 8.6. So that's a big range. So I will be thinking about how can I actually reduce the uncertainty maybe a bit more. And in this case, what I would do, I would just stop and think. So in this case, what I would want to understand from my game, that would be number one, how much content do we actually have, right? Like, is it safe to assume that people can still be playing the game on day 365? And if not, well, probably we'd be finding ourselves in that worst scenario. Are users socially engaged? So that's another thing, right? In case you've got a strong engagement, in that case, well, probably people will churn less in the long term. How are users currently engaged? It's also another thing, right? Like how much they love the game, how many sessions do they have, what's their behavior? And then, of course, some industry benchmarks, like AppsFlyer's got some pretty good retention benchmarks. And by combining these things together, I would think about, hey, am I going to rather be kind of somewhere rather up there or maybe rather below there?
Yeah, especially how much content. It's definitely something very important. There is this concept of game depth. So how much content will last and how long people will play. And it's something that a game developer engineer did since the beginning, thinking really to engage the user and making them doing a task on playing the game for years in terms of games economy and in terms of activity and where they can spend. So it's really content, I would say this is definitely it's a very important element to know. And the beginning, maybe you create an MVP of the game. You don't have that much content, so you can't rely on a very, very long curve.
Thanks, Roberto. I totally agree. I think the content is kind of critical. If the content is good, of course. If it's a shitty content, I can't imagine this will make such a big difference.
Yeah,
but if you've got a good content and a good game, then of course this is quite critical. So we got different scenarios. In case we want it to be fancy, you can just assign weights to, let's say, different kinds of scenarios, right? And through this is just a demonstration where I did assign some weights to these scenarios, and this would be the curve that I would come up with. So would it be like super close to reality? You never know before you measure it, but I would be quite confident in the fact that it's probably going to be fairly close, just in case I kind of understand what game I have and what is the longevity of that. So this is the end of the second concept, right? So basically, up until now, we had day 120, but through our analysis and through our thinking, like we estimated that, all right, the day 365 could be somewhere around 2%. So, lady, we're probably not gonna need you. But what we have now, we basically find ourselves in a great spot. We already understand the full curve from day 0 to day 360. So now we can do quite some interesting things with it. And I would like to demonstrate that on the concept number 3 as the last concept before we actually go to the practical example. And it's going to be about retention profiles and how to use them. And I was breaking my brain kind of how to even explain what retention profiles or retention multiplication profiles are. And it would just end up being a weird definition. So I'm rather going to explain how they work on yet another example. So once you actually have the idea of the full curve, what's really beautiful about that, like in case you know that your users behave quite similarly, you can use this curve and the numbers to predict new cohorts. And this is kind of how to think about it, right? So if we've got 48% retention on day 1 and 26% on day 7, that basically means that there's going to be 50% of the day 1 retention on day 7. So imagine if we got day 1 retention, we can already kind of predict what's going to happen on day 7. And in the same way, we can compare these values from day 1 to day 30. So once again, if we've got day 1, we can estimate what day 30 will be, and so on and so forth. Now, a few things, or not a few things, rather like an idea why I believe that this is what works so well. Sometimes sometimes it doesn't work that well on day 1, but sometimes it works, for example, on day 7, right? But what really happens from day 0 to day 1 is that the users that are not interested in the game, they just kind of die off. And the rest of the users that come back on day 1, that's a very strong predictor that they are probably somehow a part of your core audience. And the core audience tends to behave very similarly. So the day 0 to day 1 retention, these can be like very different kinds of drops from different channels just because you're buying certain kinds of audience. But once you get to day 1, and once you get this predictor of the person coming back, the curves tend to be quite stable, even for the day 1 retention, even for very long time frames. And of course, it's got to be analyzed, and that's something that we're going to be doing later today. But that's what I feel is quite important to say, that there's quite some magic just to be done with only day 1s or day 7s in terms of the predictions. So if we kind of went over all of these retention points, we can organize them neatly into a table. And basically what it says is there's going to be 54% of this number left on day 7, and so on and so forth. It's probably better seen inside of the chart. That, for example, in case you've got day 1 of 50%, to get the day 30, you just multiply that by 0.33 because it's just going to be 33%. And with this, with the knowledge of the retention curve values, you can already see how super useful that can be, because now you can already start to predict the values for your cohorts just in this way. You can just kind of multiply the new cohort numbers with these retention multiplicators, and you will be able, as we already went through, calculate the retention curve, all the points on the curve, calculate the active days, and just multiply that by the ARPDAU, and there's your LTV/ROAS prediction right there. So that's going to be the retention multiplication profiles, and that's the last concept that we wanted to go through before actually showing the real data. I don't know if Roberto wants to add something on the retention multiplication profiles.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the first points is that you really have to know your data. When I start working with the client, it's important to go there, check about retention, deep dive in the different curves for the different geo, if it's changing over time, it's changing by channel. So it's really important to understand what's the difference, what if the retention is stable, if the retention is changing, why, and starting to making question. And as always, it's important to visualize and to get familiar with the numbers, because then you can reuse them as well for the LTV prediction.
Absolutely agreed. So thanks, Roberto. And I see no questions in the chat, so let's just move to the final kind of show off where we're going to combine all of these concepts and show that on the real data. And before I move to Google Sheets, I just want to describe the data a bit so you kind of have a feel of what we're going to be going through. So there's a couple of dimensions, organic and paid data. Then there's like 3 paid user acquisition channels plus organic. And we've got 3 countries and we've got 5 months. All of that, of course, with the volume of installs, the costs, and then the retention numbers.
Exactly. This is a common scenario where a game has or don't have an organic stream of installs coming from Google Play or Apple Store. And then in this case, for example, we have we open different channels, user acquisition channel, where we are acquiring user in different channels. Channel can be Google, can be Facebook, Meta, can be Unity or the networks, can be anything you would like to experiment on. And then, of course, there is where we are gonna experiment. In this case, a different country, and there is the month dimension.
Yep. And by the way, this is like a specifically picked example because this is the data that you can probably get, from your attribution provider. Yeah, once again, getting back to hopefully being that practical, so you can really imagine how you're using even your reports in this fashion. And what I'm going to be demonstrating. So that's basically number 1, creating the day 1 retention profile, then analyzing the profile. So that's really going to hopefully answer the question, is it fine if we just kind of use this one curve that we created so far, or are there, let's say, big differences in terms of the behavior of the users, let's say from different countries or from different channels? So you should analyze it to see if we're kind of well off with just one curve, or whether we should have more, because otherwise our predictions will not be precise. And then we're going to select the profiles, put that into a calculator, and at the end of the day, I'm going to show you how to analyze a new cohort, and then how to analyze, like, let's say, a new channel using all this data that we will go through. So now I will ask our beautiful backstage whether you can see the data sheet.
Yes.
So the backstage is probably 10 seconds delayed, but I can see it on the screen. So let's go. So this is the source data, right? We've got retentions in absolute values. So in case we wanted to create retention profile to day 1, we already know that's basically just taking all of these retention numbers for day 7 up to day 360 and comparing that with day 1. So I can kind of show you how to do it. In this case, it would be 40 by 40, so it doesn't make any sense. But in case we compare day 7 to day 1, we just kind of do it this way. We take we kind of keep the absolute for age, for the column age, and then as you
all is
see,
perfect, Martin. Just to say, sorry to interrupt you, but everything's perfect.
All right, Nenad, thank you very much for the information. Perfect. You are also beautiful, by the way.
Thanks.
So day 360 divided by day 1, right? So just kind of making sure that it happens. So yes, basically every retention data point gets fractioned with the day one. And there we go. I would be able to kind of just pull the data, but here I've got it already prepared. So this is how we created the retention profiles. And please remember, these are not the actual retention numbers, right? So in this case, you see like 60%. So no, it doesn't mean at all that retention is 60%. It just means that there's going to be 60% left of the day one people on day 7. So that's one thing to make sure that everybody understands. And how I would kind of now go about analyzing the data, right? Because I'm thinking, so what does it really tell me, right? Can I just be using that one curve or multiple curves? So there's a few things that I would do. And I already created a few pivots just to show it off so I don't have to kind of struggle with controlling the pivots on the call. But you see that first question that I would be asking is the day one retention profile stable over time? So it's over time dimension. So the curves you see here, these are curves from different months, right? And I wanted to really get rid of the influence of, let's say, different channels. So I'm just using organic because it tends to be the most stable, of course. And I'm also using just one country because it can really be different in different countries. So that's how I filtered it. And now if I look at the curve, it looks really stable. And of course, like there's some differences, but inherently there's always going to be variance. But I don't see that much variance. So my conclusion here would be there probably were not that many, let's say, influential changes inside of the game that would somehow increase day further retention versus day one retention or something like that. And there's like nothing goofy going on because the organic traffic and its behavior in terms of the retention is quite stable. So that would be conclusion number one. Now, the second thing I would be looking at, that would be retention profiles over different countries. And here you see I picked Philippines, a group of tier 1 countries, and the US as 3 examples. Once again, you have to be very careful when filtering things out. So in this case, once again, that is just organic traffic. And here you see quite some differences, right? So the tier 1 and US, and by the way, the tier 1 in this case, it was tier 1 minus US, so it's kind of not the same thing. It's definitely not the same thing. So you see that the tier 1 and US have a very, very similar behavior when it comes to retention profile, but Philippines is very different. So what it tells me, in case I'm going to be running ads in Philippines or running campaigns in Philippines or trying to understand my ROAS in Philippines, I cannot use the same retention profile as I'd be using for the tier 1 countries or the US. So it's already something that I found, right? I have to go deeper into, or I have to go deeper. I would have to generate multiple retention profiles at the end of the day. And this is the last one, and that's how is day 1 retention profile stable per channel. So once again, carefully filtering things out. In this case, it's just US. The reason for that is just because in the US for this data set, I was able to get data for all of these 3 channels, where is blue, green, and red. So I was able to compare all of them. In case I used a different country, they would probably just contain 1 or 2 of these channels. And in this case, what you see is that one of these channels is like very close to organic. So green channel is very close to organic, but the other 2 channels are actually quite different in terms of the profiles. And now, although it does not seem like such a big deal because the curves are kind of close, you see there's quite some gaps in between them. And from the previous curves, as we calculated the LTVs from these retentions, you probably remember that they can actually diverge quite a lot over a long period of time. And imagine this is 360 days. So in this case, my conclusion absolutely would be I have to have definitely different retention profiles for different channels. And I also would need different profiles for countries. And definitely I would have to be looking much deeper into the data because it's kind of clear that the differences can be quite big. One last point to it, I would not be going super ballistic on all the data. I would probably be really kind of trying to figure out, let's say, the countries or the channels or the countries and channel combination for the ones where I want to be running paid user acquisition. That could be useful for me.
As experience for the games that I'm working with, normally there is a kind of different behavior of the profile, especially if we go on channel level and not that much in time, not that much on geo. Definitely there is more strong variation on channel level, and as well inside of the same channel, you really have to maybe doing the same exercise, checking the retention profile, understanding one type of campaign, for example, a value optimization campaign against a different kind of campaign that is Insta campaign or it's event campaign. So this kind of campaign, they might have a very strong different retention profile. So it's something that is important to check it out.
Absolutely, and this is what we saw many times, that there's quite a difference between channels. It's probably just due to the fact that there's quite different incentives sometimes, and in case that's, for example, incentivize installs or things like that can definitely like change the monetization, or in this case the retention profile entirely, because users have very different, let's say, motivations to install the game. So that's why we're doing this analysis, right? Because as you see, the differences can be quite substantial. We will see more of that in a bit. Just before I continue, I see questions from Eric in the chat. We will definitely stop once we're done with it and answer the questions. And for Merit, yes, the deck will be definitely shared and together with the project files. So you're going to have a chance to play with that in case you want to. So the last mile now. This would be my conclusion from this quick analysis. If that was actually something that I would really kind of be doing fully, I would probably be spending 1 hour, 2 hours on that, really kind of going through the data, splitting that in different ways, and really trying to understand things, probably trying to even understand what is the impact on the LTVs from the different, let's say, retention profiles. But in this case, let's just limit ourselves to one quick conclusion, and that is that the channels and the channel retention profiles are different. So here I got them in the table, and I'm just gonna copy paste them into our analysis sheet. And that's something we use with Roberto for, let's say, the simpler cases, in case we have the retention profiles and kind of just want to see some curves and understand a bit the recoup time. Of course, in case you are more advanced, have more channels, and you want to have that in the reporting, that's a different thing entirely, and it can be automated. But for today, let me just copy paste these retention profiles into our input and tell you a bit about how this analysis sheet works. So now we basically fed the information of the retention profiles into some sheets which do calculations. And this is the master sheet that allows us now to look into it and to kind of analyze what's going on. So this is the main table where we're inputting our retention. We can pick the different retention profile based on which to model the resulting curve. And based on the data available, we can decide we're going to be using different retention data points. So in this case, we would only have day 1. So like there's nothing else we can be using. But let's say that we also have day 7. So in this case, of course, it makes more sense to use day 7 because it's probably going to be more precise for the long-term prediction. So this is where we input the basic retention and pick the profile and the day that we want to be using as a baseline. And besides that, we also input the ARPDAU as the first business input and the CPI. And once we do all of these things, we can start to see quite some magic. So let's imagine that we are going to be using channel green, and that we measured that our day 1 retention would be, and let's say it's going to be 40%, right? So in this case, let's see what happens. And you see that there's quite a number of curves in this chart. This one shows the active days. So you see that over the 365 days, we can expect, even just with this lousy day 1 retention number, just because we understand the retention in the long term and we've got the retention profiles, we can understand that we can expect probably somewhere around 33 active days on day 365. And we can also see how these kind of grow, right? So we see that the retention is like, it's not stopping. It's probably going to be used for quite some time to come. This is the CPI, so this is green line below here. right? So it's a stable line because once again, we know that since the very beginning. And this is the calculated revenue. So you can think of that as a CPI. So it kind of grows based on our active days accumulation. And what's kind of interesting here, you can clearly see where these two things kind of do cross. And we even have it calculated inside of here. So it's actually a day 140, and it's a break-even day. So basically, in case we have a retention of 40%, we can expect the break-even to happen in, let's say, 20 weeks. But let's say that the retention will be only 25%. So in that case, we can quite likely also expect that there's going to be recoup, but it's going to take quite a long time, right? So this already gives you a beautiful tool to do the what-if analysis. And it can be used the other way around, right? Like you might not be happy with this kind of a break-even point, which I definitely would not be happy with. So in this case, you might think, so how if we really kind of worked on the game and improved the retention by some points? So in case, and now let's simplify things. Let's just say that if we take it to 35% as day one, what would happen, right? And this, in my eyes, is like the biggest beauty of the tool, that you can kind of really play with the numbers and get a better understanding about what different CPIs could mean, right? Let's say that we managed to do some better ads, and and we screw up the whole sheet. So let's say we do better, and we have a $4 CPI. So you can, once again, you can see that very clearly in the break-even analysis. And this is a supporting table where you can kind of understand more about what's going on, but I will just leave it to explore in case it's something you find interesting. So that will be a cohort analysis. Let's say that we're doing, we're running UA campaigns on one channel. We see the retention fluctuating. So for each week, we kind of go here and we can check what's going on. What does it actually mean for our long-term ROAS? And one last thing that I would like to show is the predictions for new channels. And that's been historically quite a big challenge, right? Because in case you're going to start running your first channel, like you're running Google Ads and Facebook, and now you're starting with Unity, or you're running Facebook and Google and Unity, and you're starting with TikTok, you can safely expect that the retention profiles will be quite different. And that's why we kind of implemented into this quick calculation table the way to understand these different retention profiles all at once. So you see, we've got kind of these different retention profiles, and then we can look at a chart that with each curve, it kind of shows us what the recoup will be, what the LTV will be in time. And once again, you don't really have to be using that with actual data for your channels and campaigns, these retention profiles. You can just kind of model it based on what you believe is realistic. You can even create some scenarios, for example, for TikTok, like what if it's going to be, let's say, 50% of the Google channel, or what if it's going to be 20% worse? And through this, you once again will be able to kind of see things in perspective, which is the most beautiful thing. You're not just kind of left to some guesses and stuff and think about what does it really do to your 365-day LTV. You can really understand it super well and then decide if you are basically willing to get your skin wet and take risk, let's say.
Yeah, what I would like to add is that day one retention, as we saw, it's just one data point, but it's so important because it can really change completely the course of a game and the success of a game. So day one, definitely, it's super important. Can drive a lot of impact, especially for some kind of game. Let's say if you're working on hyper casual, so you really have to maximize the number of revenue that you get early on as maximum as possible. So your retention has to be good enough to then support the curve and the spending that you're doing on user acquisition. And what is really interesting on this chart, maybe we can go back on the chart.
Oh, I stopped sharing, Roberto, so I probably will have to
okay, no problem.
Try doing it again if you want to.
So it's really interesting to see where is your risk, how the ROAS is evolving, because, okay, we predict LTV, but then what is really interesting is the money, when you get the money back. And so you can see what's evolution on the ROAS on time, and you say, okay, for example, in 120 days, I'm going to recover only 50%, or maybe 80%, or I'm really positive ROAS. So it's something that really can help you to visualize, and then you can bring this information on your bank account, and then you really can understand if it's something that you can support and you can push even more on user acquisition. So as mentioned, as Martin was saying, you can play scenario, you can start to have benchmark for channel, you can go in a new channel with the data, with the benchmark that you need to be profitable. So understanding this LTV, having this flexibility to understand the changes, how the variables are moving, and what actually you can afford are critical to succeed on your game. So I think that this prediction is kind of basic for me as user acquisition manager, for me to trying to scale a game, helping developers. So it's something that it's really relevant.
So thank you, Roberto, very much for the additional color. And this is basically it that we got prepared for today. So hopefully it was interesting. I think we covered quite a lot of ground and kind of showed that you don't really need sophisticated tools and data teams to do the calculations. The concepts are not that difficult to grasp, and hopefully we shed some light or strengthen these inside of your minds for a bit. And as the next step, we will be sharing these project files and also, of course, the slides and the video recording. So that's what I feel is kind of maybe the biggest value, because maybe you want to kind of rewatch that in case you would like to be creating these things on your own.
Yeah, and some other notes is that's definitely it's a good starting point. You can build on these. You can start to understand, learning the metrics, how they interact between each other. Then, of course, you always have to cross-check prediction with reality, and you always have to try to go back and to see the cohorts maturing, and if they're actually matching your prediction. And for the rest, yes, it's a question of using every day. And I think that any user acquisition or any person that is working on spending money, investing money on a game has to have this control over LTV and ROAS, payback time, and to have in this mind that it's not a number. LTV, it's a curve, and you need to work with all these kind of elements at the same time to be successful.
Perfect. Thank you, Roberto. And now I think we can get to the questions and then call it a day. So question from Eric: in case we have a hybrid monetization in-app purchases plus ads, how do you suggest to do the projection? I was thinking about this quite a bit, and originally what we did, we basically kind of allocated both sources of monetization, so for the ads and also for the in-app purchases, into the ARPDAU, and then we kind of calculated that basically together based on the retention curves. And it was not that far from the truth, but I think it just screws up the data to a certain extent, because in case you've got a whale that makes purchases, in the first couple of days, that just throws off the fractions completely, right? And where the retention is super stable, even if you've got smaller cohorts, in case you kind of mix it in with the in-app purchases, that can really be very, very, very imprecise, I would say. So my current approach is like, this is something that we do for the ad monetization part, and in case it's in-app purchases involved, we kind of do that separately. And we also use the fraction method, but it needs, I think if you've got these two metrics kind of separated, you can then better analyze the campaigns, because you kind of have a better grasp on what can you expect and what can be just a random fluctuation. So that would be my answer to that. And another question that comes from Eric: regarding iOS campaigns, based on our experience, can I consider opt-out users' behavior similar to opt-in users? To be honest, I don't think we ever did this for iOS, actually, like comparing opt-in and opt-out users. So in this case, it's like, that's always a question, how much data you've got, how, let's say, how close are the data you see for countries on the platform level? For example, comparing that Android versus iOS. The behavior can be different, but you can kind of work with the data to create the fractions, even you don't really have these kinds of data on iOS.
Yeah, I would assume that maybe they behave the same, but that's assumption. But definitely I can say that you have to take in consideration a different ARPDAU, because users that give the opt-in have a higher ARPDAU because the network, they know them and they are able to pay more, so they're going to have higher CPM. So definitely you need to use a different ARPDAU in the formula and the calculation.
Yep, absolutely. But to be honest, Eric, in these cases, it's really kind of a case-by-case basis. And what we showed you, kind of this analysis of, well, different countries and different time frames and things like that. This is exactly what I'd be doing, and I'd be trying to find some patterns. And in case I did not find any patterns, I would probably go just like for countries, for example. But really a question. So we don't see any other questions in chat. So Nenad, what's your take? Should we call it a day?
Do you want to call it a day? I see you
Well,
guys
not a day.
enjoying this.
Should we call it a webinar?
Yeah, like I would like to see what others are saying about you guys. Like, you know that I'm a starstruck whenever I speak to you. You know, there is a decent respect in it because I know how much you know and stuff. I would like to see, you know, how others are seeing all this. Is it valuable for you? Do you learn a lot? And also, does it like, is this good enough for me to push these guys to do another presentation? And you know, it's not hard to get them here in this room to prepare all these things. And I want, based on your feedback, to be able to, you know, give them the little push to do this more often. Yes. And one more thing, yes, that I noticed, like there is not a lot of questions, like either is, and not a lot of people who left the webinar during the presentation, which means that, you know, it was quite simple for them. Not that much for me though, but I guess it was simple enough.
I think at this point, Nenad, we can ask the audience for any kind of a feedback that they can give us, of course. And if
Yeah,
there was
please,
anything
guys, feel free to reach out to us. Yes.
In the future. And yeah, I also presume that there's going to be some people on the video watching this later. So super happy for any kind of a feedback about the presentation, about the methods, because there's multiple ways to skin a cat, and we are well aware of that, and we are testing different things all the time. So super happy to hear, you know, what is it that you are doing, and maybe even jump on a call and kind of compare the methods and the know-how, because that's how we can keep at the edge. So one last thing that Simar is writing. Thank you for the presentation. You are very welcome. For play-to-win apps, our retention seems to spike during certain weeks because of weekly offers.
Yeah, that seems the case where the retention is actually changing quite a lot with seasonality. And yeah, it's something that has to be balanced on data, probably. If it's just a part of the year, maybe take it out and compensate. I'm not sure what kind of approach we can use it to kind of consider these spikes without breaking the kind of prediction.
I'm just thinking, what are play-to-win apps? Is it like in-app purchase monetized apps, Simar?
Yeah, so it's not there are different kind of monetization systems, so not necessarily only ads. So I don't know what's the sharing between ads and yeah, not sure we kind of share in between ads and actually in-app purchase. Maybe Sima can tell us a bit more.
Like what we saw multiple times is that let's say you're running live ops, right? So in these cases, kind of retention spikes on different calendar days. But if this is something that you had in mind, this basically kind of gets dissolved in the cohorts because different people started to play at different let's say days of the week. So it kind of becomes basically imprinted inside of the fabric of the retention numbers and then of the profiles. Like sweepstakes, you play games and earn tokens which are entered into retail price. Oh, okay. Yeah, sure thing. Yep. I don't think it's a question. It's kind of just a note here. So I don't think there's anything to answer. Or am I mistaken?
I think it's connected to the previous thing that he wrote there.
All right. By the way, thanks, Imar, for the feedback. And sure, agree with the fast pacing is kind of the idea. But sure thing. Thank you for contributing. And with that, I believe we can say our goodbyes. Nenad, what do you think?
Yeah, definitely. Yes. I just want to say thank you, everyone, for joining us again. And soon enough, we are preparing another webinar. And be on a lookout for that. We'll reach out via email to you guys.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Take care, and thank you very much for joining.
Yes.
And super happy for any feedback. Bye, Nenad.
Bye-bye.